Hello and welcome. This is the 14th lecture of the Stream Ecology series from the summer of 2020 at SMCM. This lecture will cover some basic biology about fishes and then deal with some of the interesting features about the ecology of fishes related to stream ecology. The following lecture, which is a paired lecture, deals with fish families that we find in Maryland. One of the reasons that I deal with fishes separately is because I want to stress that a lot of other groups have actually been better studied for their impacts on stream ecology and may have, in some sense, larger impacts on those. But fishes certainly receive a lot of attention, and for a variety of reasons, one of which is because we interact with them many directly and we eat them, right? So there's some sort of direct relationship to humans. But there's a number of small fishes which occur in streams which don't get nearly as much attention and which are undoubtedly important as well. And here we'll try to stress the importance of a lot of these different members. Fishes come in a variety of different shapes and sizes, lots of different colors. You'll hear about those in the next lecture. But they're really an interesting group, and there's certainly work to be done on understanding how they relate to streams. And as we do in these lectures, I provide the objective slide right away. So what I would like you to do at the end of this lecture is provide a working definition of a fish. Okay, there's a lot of diversity here. We need to have some way to group them. I want you to be able to explain something about the importance of fish to stream ecology, and I want you to understand by the end of this lecture that sometimes the answer is we don't know. And I also want you to be able to classify fish not just by, okay, this is a species, this species is, let's say, a bluegill or American eel, but think about other ways in which we could classify these organisms to help us understand how they interact and how they modify stream ecology. All right, so the first thing that people frequently ask is, what's a fish? And that's a good question. And in their mind, they often think of something that lives in the water and that has scales and that has a backbone. That's fine, except that many fish don't have scales. Some of them don't live in water that often. And yes, they do all have backbones, but certainly that would include anything with a backbone. So a snake would be a fish then if you're just going to rely on backbone, or a bird would be a fish if you're just going to rely on that. So we need to be a little bit more specific about this. And actually, it turns out if you're going to use the word fish, I have to warn you that there's no good unifying definition for them because it includes a broad range of animals. And if you look at this, now I understand for people that are checking this phylogeny carefully that this is an older phylogeny and is out of date already, but it does have some relationships, or I should say broadly the relationships within it are true. But if you do this, what you'll see nestled in and amongst all these different fish shapes is our own group deeply nestled in the middle here. And that means that if you're willing to call members on the left and the right of our own group fish, which I suspect that you are very happy to do, then we have to be careful and we have to acknowledge that the word fish does not encompass a biological grouping. It's an artificial grouping. Now, stepping back and thinking about that from the perspective of stream ecology, that means that what am I talking about when I think about a fish? Well, I mean an aquatic vertebrate that spends its entire life in fresh water, never leaves. They can be scaled. They frequently have large gills, and they are sometimes able to utilize atmospheric oxygen. But the majority of them are highly dependent on the aquatic system for their oxygen and all their other basic needs. So the idea of a fish broadly, I want you to be thoughtful about it. Doesn't necessarily make sense in a biological framework, but because a lot of these swimming vertebrates share features together, we often place them in the same group. Now, there's a lot of diversity within the fish, but really there's one group that has done very, very well, and that group is the bony fish. This is a classic example of a bony fish. This is a salmonid. But the bony fish are pretty straightforward. Their anatomy is the same as your own anatomy, right? We recognize that because we are a modified bony fish. What you can see here is many of the organs that you are familiar with or that you can think about are present in fish as well. The one that people are not as comfortable with is the swim bladder. And you might think to yourself, we don't have a swim bladder. Well, it turns out the swim bladder is actually the lung. In fact, it is very similar to an organ you have. The difference is that most fishes that we interact with use the swim bladder for buoyancy. Very small, or I should say smaller numbers of them are actually relying on it for respiration. So the swim bladder is primarily an air sac within the body that helps maintain buoyancy so the fish can move up and down the water column. Now in a stream, most streams are fairly shallow, so you're not moving up and down very far in the water column. But again, we always have to make the note that there are no two streams that are truly identical, and certainly streams span the spectrum from very shallow, a few centimeters, to very, very deep, tens of meters to maybe even hundreds of meters deep, potentially in some locations. Okay, so I want to be careful about saying that it's never true that you wouldn't need a swim bladder. Certainly some fish in the deeper waters would use it. There are also some basic features which I'm going to expect you to understand about fish. Those being things like the eye, mouth, nostrils. I'm going to anticipate you know what a dorsal, a pectoral, a pelvic, and an anal fin are, as well as a caudal fin. Fish also have this cool system called the lateral line that is used to detect vibrations in the water column. And those are about as far as you need to go. They also have scales. You'll probably be aware of that. But be aware that there are these fins, and I do want you to know them because they're going to be really important for identifying different groups of fish when we move on to that. There's also a fin that you did not see in the previous image called an adipose fin. It's a fleshy fin that appears between the dorsal and the caudal fin in some groups. I just wanted to show it here. I don't like the idea of showing it on an image where there is a fish that doesn't exist with all the fins on it. I think it's confusing. Adipose fins occur on a few groups of fish, and this is a good example. Again, a salmonid with an adipose fin there tucked away on the dorsal surface. All right, we're not going to do this in this lecture, but I wanted to expose you to it right now so that you could be thinking about it. There are 23 families of fish in Maryland, and we will get to them when we move forward on the next lecture. But I just want you to be aware there's quite a bit of diversity in these body plans, and they do share a lot of features, but there are some really striking differences that make them easy to separate from each other. Now, one of the questions you might ask as we get into this lecture is, do fish matter at all to stream ecology? And G. Evelyn Hutchinson, who wrote this book, a treatise on limnology, and was really the father of modern limnology and really an early thinker in modern ecology, did not think so. In fact, in his book here, this is actually just volume 1. There's multiple volumes, right, to the treatise on limnology, which deals with all types of freshwater bodies. He does not include them at all. They don't appear anywhere. And he was a very thoughtful and intelligent man. So it wasn't that he had some sort of vendetta against them. He just didn't see any effects immediately related to this from his work in these systems. This is a picture of him. Not the turtle with the crazy eyes. Something went on there. No, but the man to the right, G. Evelyn Hutchinson, of course, is very, very important. If you're a biology student, his thinking has influenced you, even if you don't recognize it. So just be aware that he is certainly a very important figure within the field of ecology. If you went through and did the reading already, you'll also notice that it mentioned something about the river continuum concept. And I want you to be aware that that is going to be very closely related to fish and what kind of fish we see and their body plans, but we're not going to deal with the river continuum concept until we can deal with it completely on its own. So I really want to spend the time to look at it as this unique thing and not as like a little bit here, a little bit there. I want you to see it more holistically than that. But the important thing I really want you to take away from this slide is, do fish matter? And the early workers said, no. They don't appear to very much in streams. Seems unusual to me now, and this is from a much later perspective, right? So I have far more opportunity to read about different fields of ecology than these individuals had at the time. And certainly far more research has been done, right? The amount of research that's been done even in a year, let's say in the last couple years, has been more than they had access to in their entire careers, right? You think about the number of people working on it and published studies. So maybe it isn't surprising that as we start to understand the cake is very layered, that we start to say, well, in fact, when you take out that layer, it is important. There is some change in that in the early 1980s and 1990s, and certainly people started to recognize, okay, fish do occasionally have large impacts in lakes. We'll give you that, but we're not going to go any further. Okay, but in the early 80s and 90s, there was some really interesting work that showed, in fact, herbivorous and detritivorous fishes can cause trophic cascades, and that these might be really important in streams. All right, and if you don't know what a trophic cascade is, be patient. I'll show you what that is. We've already talked a little bit about it, but we should review it again. And so the importance of fish related to stream ecology still remains, I would argue, to some degrees unclear. But there is evidence that at least in some cases it is very important. And I suspect that if you really look at the literature body, there's good indication that fish have really strong impacts. But we aren't entirely clear exactly what those are, and disentangling each individual impact is very, very difficult to do. There's a lot of diversity in streams. Many of these organisms fill similar niches and overlap in a lot of ways, including diet. And so removing of a single individual may not, or single individual species may actually not let you see that effect. You may have to remove a lot of very similar individuals to see the effect. And that's going to make it very, very difficult to study. Because if we're going to have to remove all of, let's say, the small insectivorous minnows from a stream, that's going to be difficult. That's going to require a lot of effort and a lot of different ways to do it. One of the important examples of fish having impact on stream ecology is this guy, the stone roller. In which case stone rollers love to eat algae. They have really highly developed anatomy to do just that. And they eat algae so much and they eat it so well that they actually remove it from a stream and change what groups are favored. So if you look at a stone roller's mouth, what you'll see is this, I know it's a little bit hard to see here, but this cartilaginous ridge on the lower lip, right, just above this red line. And that cartilaginous ridge is really tough and allows them to scrape off algae from rocks. And when they're doing this, of course, what's growing on rocks? Well, diatoms are the ones that are more dominant in streams. But because they are selecting for diatoms, because they find diatoms tasty, right, they're going to leave behind algae they don't find tasty. They're not going to crop down those types of algae. So cyanobacteria actually become more abundant when they're in the system. If diatoms are changing, right, if the algae composition is changing on rocks, we would anticipate that things reliant on algae are going to change, right? The inverts that are very dependent on that algae are going to change because they aren't going to have the algae that they prefer, let's say, or maybe groups that are able to eat a wider variety of different species are able to exist in that environment, right? So they also can cause changes, knock-on changes in other groups. And there's good information to suggest that they can change how snails behave in environments, right? That they adopt different life histories when stone rollers are around because of issues related to competition, which is all very cool. And you might, oh, who cares about snails? Well, when you start to change, you start to have these large knock-on effects, then it's going to have ramifications much further afield than just the snails, right? The fact that snails are going to have things that are dependent on them, or that they're going to graze differently, or they're going to change the way in which they interact with the environment. We should be thinking more holistically instead of saying, well, it's just a snail. It is just a snail, but it also has larger effects. And this is a classic example of a trophic cascade. Let me erase my markup here. In which case you add some upper trophic level, and that upper trophic level has a major impact on lower trophic levels. So in this case, you've got, I know it's a little unusual because it's not a predator, and the picture here is of adding a predator to a system, which causes all its prey to get eaten, and then a ton of mid-range plankton to survive, and then they crop down the phytos. But in this case, you're adding a relatively large-bodied algivore, which is going to crop down the algae instead. And that's actually going to cause the middling levels to decline because they won't have algae to feed them. And it's going to highly support very, very abundant sort of mid-range sized animals, right? And central stone rollers, it turns out, pretty big. You can actually catch them on small hooks and lines. And so that may have really strong impacts on whether piscivores, especially things like birds, are able to survive in those streams because they can provide lots of nutrition for those types of animals. So the idea that a single species of fish can have really important impacts on stream ecology is cool, and that's certainly important because what we just described is a common species we find in a lot of streams in the United States. But if we were to zoom out a little bit and think about how do streams in general interact with fish and how do fish interact with their streams, then we want to be more about broader groupings of fish, right? We don't want to be, well, this species is the only thing that matters. We really want to be able to say, does this group matter? Does that group matter? So we have a more holistic view of this. One thing that will guide us in our thinking about this is what would we expect to find if fish had large impacts, right? So we have to think in the process of what questions might we ask of the system so that we can figure out how fish are actually impacting it. So think about that as we move forward in the lecture. You'll see a number of effects that fish can have on streams. This is a smallmouth bass in case you were wondering. Fish, as we've actually already talked about, are conduits of nutrition for sure, right? So you should have, in your mind, you should think to yourself, oh, right, we had that allochthonous lecture where we actually talked about this to a degree. And you'll see here's some examples of that, right? In this one particular place where they did an estimation of how many of the salmon ended up in the forest, or how many moved into the terrestrial zone. You can see that 80% of the salmon run, which is all the salmon that come back to spawn, ended up in the forest because bears were moving them there. So that's a lot of material, right? And in general, the bears are also pooping in the woods, it turns out. Bears do poop in the woods. And so even if the salmon was eaten by the bear, by and large, it still ended up in the forest. And that's a lot of actual biomass, right? You can calculate that. That amounts to huge amounts like 1,600 kilograms of forest. So up to about 50% of the total nitrogen in the trees around these rivers were dependent on the salmon, which means that that's going to have a profound impact on the stream. That's going to make the trees go larger. It's going to make sure that you have more numerous older trees, right? Really big trees. You're going to have very few young trees. You're going to have a lot of woody debris that will enter the system and remain there for long periods of time. You're going to have systems that are more resilient to periods of, say, low nutrient availability in terrestrial systems because the marine system may provide those nutrients, all right? So these systems are very dependent on fish. And salmon are a great example of that, but there are other broader examples of this too. Salmon are a broader group, right? We think of, oh, I get my Atlantic salmon fillet, but this is actually a group of fish that do this. So not just salmon, but we could expect that in the past in places like Maryland, that many of our streams were also impacted very heavily by things like these migratory fish. Not salmon for us, but things like herring, which would have been very, very similar in abundance, or even more abundant in some cases. And that means that this thing that you see here is a forest generated by salmon, that half of that material at least is from the salmon in the stream itself. And that means that while the forest is shaping the salmon, right, it's providing cool waters for these animals to lay their eggs in. It's limiting how much silt and debris is getting into the water column, so there's places for these guys to breed. It's providing the things like terrestrial insects for these resulting salmon fry to come up and eat. But in the same way, the salmon or these migratory fish are shaping the forest, right? They're going to be doing things like bringing in certain kinds of nutrients and at certain times of the year, so they're going to favor certain plants. And they're going to be doing things like digging, and they're going to change the way in which the very stream itself operates. And in fact, when you remove these kind of things from the system, then you end up with a problem that these systems become extremely nutrient limited and they shift to a different type of system and actually getting them back to the original place. So when we think about restoration and I would like, let's say, migratory fish back in my region, or I'd like salmon is what people often think about. But here on the East Coast, you could say the same thing about herring. You can't just release the fish to go back to where they were because they may be in a system that's very nutrient limited and it may take a very long time for them to recover that. So in fact, you have to send people out to do things like this where they take backpacks of rotten old salmon and throw them into the forest in a similar way to the way in which bears would attract the salmon, or in our case, other animals, things like eagles, raccoons, ospreys, all sorts of mid-range mammalian predators and bears, because we have those as well on the East Coast, would have tracked our things like our herring out into the forest. Right. So just so you know, this job's real stinky, kind of hard, but you do build up some arm strength throwing salmon into the woods. Can also work in the other direction. So whilst fish can provide nutrients into the terrestrial zone, they can strip nutrients out of the terrestrial zone too. Here's a good example of that. Orange throat darters, and darters are, and orange throats are not exceptional to darters. They're probably very similar to darters, so we can expect darters to have this sort of generalized effect. Can reduce the emergence of aquatic insects. And that means that there won't be as much nutrition, or I should say material, moving from the aquatic system out to the terrestrial zone. So it will tend to make the aquatic system more self-contained, right? If you were a spider, if you remember back when we talked about that, and you were dependent on those aquatic insects, you would be very disappointed if spiders had emotions. I'm not saying that they do, uh, but that would be because you're so heavily dependent on things like those aquatic insects for your food. So maybe streams can be net importers of nutrition as well. So maybe it just depends on the system. But these effects that we see from this group, these orange-throat darters, we should anticipate that for systems with lots of darters in it. And many, many, many systems have lots of darters in it. There's a great example of a male and a female. There's really strong sexual dimorphism in darters. The male is on the bottom, right? Really attractively colored oranges and blues. Females tend to be far drabber, sort of yellows and browns, and more cryptically colored, so they don't get picked off by predators as easily. If we look at building of nests, right, a lot of fish build nests in streams, and when they do that, they actually modify the stream itself. In the picture on the lower right, you can actually see the nest there, and the reason you can detect that is you see that sort of golden brown color. That should immediately make you think, oh, golden brown in a stream on rocks, that sounds like diatoms. And all the white area is actually from the lampreys themselves, which have cleaned that substrate and washed those diatoms off because they were preparing it to breed in. And you can see they've created a fairly large area. Those nests can be a couple meters in size. And lampreys are certainly not the only thing that does this. I just really like lampreys, and this was the first thing that popped in my mind. But all sorts of migratory fish do this, and all sorts of non-migratory fish do this. They modify the stream by actually digging in it to build nests for their offspring. So fish do things like they sort particles. They change the way in which riffles flow, right? Because they're actually moving materials in and around and causing riffles and runs to move around within the stream if there's enough of them. And so this is a really important concept that the fish are, of course, being affected by the stream itself. They are choosing locations that are suitable to breed in. But by choosing suitable locations to breed in, they're modifying the stream itself, and maybe those locations are being moved. And so the stream itself is in that way living and breathing and existing too. And so it's also being modified. Other thing that we can start to think about, they can modify the system in ways we don't want, right? I have this example with sea lamprey, but this is true of a lot of migratory fish and large fish in general, in that we have problems with mercury transport. So large fish eat smaller fish, and those smaller fish have some mercury, and they bioaccumulate that mercury in their bodies. We'll talk more about mercury when we get into human impacts on streams. But for the moment, I'm comfortable with you knowing that mercury is a pollutant and that it can accumulate in animals, especially very large and old animals. And then the problem becomes that all that mercury gets dumped into these small streams, right? And so local animals that feast on these animals with lots of mercury are exposed to very high concentrations of mercury, including humans if they're catching them, right? Really dangerous kind of stuff. And the mercury is a metal. It sinks to the bottom, and it may remain in the stream for a long time, right? So it's transporting materials into these systems. The other thing I want you to start to think about now, and this should be obvious, is that they are going to be transporting in other things as well, not just mercury. So think about other pollutants that fish might bring into the system. Now we talked about groups in the form of taxonomic groups of fishes. Okay, so I've been using, let's say, whole groups here, and that is certainly useful. But I've also sort of alluded to this non-taxonomic group of fishing, migratory fishes, right? That must cover a broad range of animals. And the other important thing about this is that species are very closely related to other members within their own group, right? So a species is most closely related to members within a genus, and a genus is most closely members within a family, and a family is most closely related to members in an order. But as you descend down that, you would expect that animals in the same genus, right, would all be more similar to each other than animals in the same family, and so they'll behave in some similar ways. So maybe a way to go about doing this is to think about some sort of behavior that we can lump animals together with. Migratory behavior is a good example of that. But what other behaviors might we lump them together by? Well, you could certainly do it by this, which is feeding, right? What these animals actually feed upon if they exploit the same resource. And this is frequently called in stream ecology feeding guilds or FFGs, functional feeding groups, and we see it with aquatic insects, but we do also see it with fishes. So we might think of minnows, for instance, are really diverse, and many of them look very, very similar to one another. So why don't we lump them together as a group of insectivorous midwater predators, right? That's a feeding, you could think of that as something like a feeding guild, right? The other important thing to note here is that fishes have really strong ontogenetic shifts in their diet, which means that their diet changes really radically from when they're born to when they're an adult. So there's shifts over the course of their lifespan. So even when you describe to me a fish, right, a species, you really want to describe to me how old it is so I can know what it's actually feeding on. So functional feeding groups allows you to get away from needing to describe these to species. Guess what? Describing larvae and identifying larvae is harder than doing larger fish in some ways. And you can say functionally, oh, I caught all these small darter larvae and they all were eating X, Y, and Z. Now, they may be made of 20 different species, but who cares? Because they're all doing the same thing, right? And so they are doing it this way. And guess what? That's different than maybe the way that adult darters are doing it. Maybe they're eating small chironomids, small flies, and adults are primarily targeting mayflies, right? Then you could have this really interesting comparison that you wouldn't necessarily get if you were just focused on species alone. So there's a lot of different ways. You'll hear all sorts of different names applied to different feeding groups. And again, you are going to see this if you spend time in stream ecology. You might also want to look at functional feeding groups through time, right? So you could look at functional feeding groups. Here you have functional feeding groups that collected during the summer months in different years. And what you can see is that the populations of these different groups vary. Now you don't know what individual species make this component graph, but you can see that different functional feeding groups become more or less abundant at times, and you would expect that that is associated with the abundance of resources in those systems at the time. It appears that algal abundance was relatively high in the 2000s, right? You get this shift from relatively low abundances to much higher abundances, or maybe the species composition changed. If you look instead at maybe surface feeding, look at how surface feeding is relatively constant and high. That suggests that you have things like lots of terrestrial insects entering the system every single year, right? So lots of very important information that you can draw out of this by ignoring species and looking at this maybe as just how do these things generally function within the ecosystem. Now we've talked about moving through water when you're small, but fish do this differently. They're big animals and they move through water in a little bit of a different way. And the way in which they move through water is much more like the way that you experience moving through water. Okay? And that is that when you are swimming, what ends up happening is you have to put a lot of energy out to move forward because you're constantly slowing down. We call that drag, the resistance to you swimming. And that's because the water is a really dense thing and it's attracted to your body, right? And it causes a lot of friction on your body. And so you are slowing down constantly. So you have to put a lot of effort in to move forward. That being what would be called thrust in a plane. In addition to that, there's buoyancy from the water, which causes lift, and there's your own weight, which causes that sinking in the water column, right? So very much like a plane. In fact, modeling of planes and modeling of, say, submarines share many of the same features, okay? This would also suggest that fish can take advantage of different features about this by changing their body shape. So fish can have different, you can expect to find different impacts of fish by group just by body shape. So maybe ignore again, maybe it isn't feeding group that you're going to be focused on now. Maybe you're going to be focused on general body shape. And it shouldn't surprise you then that body shape is pretty variable between fish. And although you might be able to say, well, these are fish, right? General body shape looks like this. Certainly you'll find lots of variability in there. And one of the big changes in body shape is how things swim, right? How you actually physically move through the water because it takes a different amount of energy to move the same amount of mass depending on how you swim. I don't really want you to get too involved in this, but I do want you to see that even when we get into these sort of simple ideas about, well, how do animals move within streams, you might be able to break things up that way too, right? You might be able to break it into these different groups. And you can see there's actually, if you go into it, there's actually quite a bit of thinking that can go into this. You can start to break these out on different axes, okay? And if you were to imagine breaking these out on even more axes, right, maybe you could get into a 3D world. If you do separate things, right? You can match that behavior, that pattern with other characters, okay? So if you think of what we call a sort of a niche, which is a sort of, it's a complex idea. And I will say that the definition of a niche is really going to depend on who you talk to, but for the purposes of this course, let's define it as the environmental conditions that are suitable for an animal to live in. But you can also compare those environmental conditions to anatomy or to behaviors, right? And you can do this following something called n-dimensional hyperspace. But I don't want you to get into this. I just want you to be aware that there's this huge body of thought which goes with this, developed by none other than Hutchinson. And when you do that, you can actually plot these in like a 3D world, right? So you could plot this 3D scatter plot, which is difficult to read, but in any case, things that are similar together should fall close together, and things that are really dissimilar should fall apart from each other. And when you do that, you get this really cool, often relationship between, say, body shape and maybe genetic relatedness, and the sort of location that these points cluster in. Okay, so you can see that these body shapes, look, these long, very skinny body shapes with a long tapering tail are found to the top of this plot, whereas long body shapes with a wide tail are found to the sort of bottom and to the left. All right, and down at the bottom right, you find this very, very different body shape. It turns out, though, that there's quite a paucity of information about stream fishes and their effect on stream ecology. I think that will probably change in the future, but we certainly have lots of room to look up and learn more material about this group. And if you're interested, I would start with these two books. They've done a good job at the time that they're written of trying to summarize as much as they could about what was known. And they've certainly set the stage for us to start to look at some of these important effects that we think fish might be having on streams. All right, and in the next lecture, we'll discuss how to identify major fish families in Maryland.